So let's talk about some basic less ideas. It's meant to be just like CSS, but add some functionality to make it easier to work with. This means, like we've stated before, that all CSS is valid less. Renaming the file, as we've seen, just simply works, and then it's going to add functionality to less. If you want to mix and match, even in the same file, some standard CSS and some less style CSS, that is perfectly fine. The processor is really only looking for the things that it knows about in less, and then changing the processing for those. This allows us to fairly easily take existing CSS files, maybe CSS that we're getting from designers, and refactor them into less to make them easier to maintain and manage over time. So we saw in our demo that we have this basic syntax for variables, at, name of the variable, colon, and then some value. And the kinds of values we'll look at in a minute, but it really can take any sort of units, even complex CSS styles, like the way that background or borders are handled. It will simply know that those are values and replace them wherever they're needed. CSS style comments are also used for multi-line, but it does introduce single-line comments as well. So if you're a C++, C#, Java, or JavaScript guy, this should be really familiar. And it also introduces this idea of nested rules. Normally we would have something like a rule here, looking for ID of main, and then we'd have a set of rules inside of it. Less allows us to nest these by saying, okay, and here we have the H1s inside of the main, and we want to style them in this particular way. And this will transform them into the CSS longer style rules. And this way we can really look at richer ways of defining our CSS. Let's see this in action. So here we are in Visual Studio with our less file. And this is just as the original CSS was. We're going to do some refactoring to bring in some of these less extensions that'll help us. First thing I want to do is I've noticed that there's a couple of places where we're using black as a color, in the case of background and text color, and I hate that we're using magic strings there, so I'm going to go ahead and throw in a variable, and I'll call it our main color, and I'll just say it's black. Now, less is going to allow us to call it black here, or even say black. Whatever the value here is what it's going to replace. It's not going to interpret one color over another. I'll just copy that and use it in the couple of places we're using just black, which is here in the body's main color. And then on our container, we're also using it for the foreground color of our container. And if we run this in the browser, we refresh because there was some browser cache going on, we can see we're getting that. Our main container is using black as the main color as well as that background. Let's come up here to the color and let's change this to green. We can see it changed not only the background here, but also all the text colors in here, because we changed it in one place and it's propagating that because it's processing the less to all those other places. Let's use a couple of other ideas here. First is commenting. So let's say we want to take the padding out of our container. Instead of having to wrap it with the CSS style commenting, we can simply just put double slashes in front of it, because that is a comment style that is supported in less. And there we can see our padding disappeared. We can go ahead and get rid of that and watch it reappear, that small padding we had. The other thing that you can do that's not so obvious is this notion of how imports work. So when you're importing a CSS file, it does exactly the same thing that CSS does, which is tell the browser to go ahead and import that file as a second separate CSS to include in this main CSS. Let's go ahead and take our init.css here and let's go ahead and change it to a less file. And this is significant because we can tell less that we want to import another less file, and in the syntax of less, you can either specify it as less or just not include an extension, and it'll assume it is less. Let's go ahead and press F5. Save this and view it in the browser, and nothing is any different here, except it really is. Let's look at what happens with our less file here. Now, why do we have all this magic here on top? The reason we do is it is literally taken what is the content of our init.less, and during processing, it has merged it into this file. And so this is another way where you can build larger CSS files from a lot of smaller less files in one fell swoop, and it allows you to create that modularization without worrying about a bunch of round trips. Sometimes with CSS, you decide to not break it up into individual files because you want fewer round trips to the server to pull them back. In this case, it's actually batching them together into a single file. Let's create a new file so we can see what this actually looks like. So there isn't a less file here, but we can look for a CSS file or even a text file. And I'm just going to call this our colors.less. And this is a pretty common approach where you have different sorts of categories of items that you're going to be included in other files. And I'll go ahead and take our color we defined here. I'll take it out of our main less file and put it in our colors. As long as I import the colors file, it's still going to work. Because what it's done is it's brought in those less extensions that we've added there and is just using for the pre-processing. We could look at the less and see that the processing worked, but that line of the variable is going to disappear because it's only used as a processing instruction, if you want to think about it in that way. Let's head back to the slides. Let's dive into some of these specific list features and look at them in more detail. Let's talk about variables. Variables end up representing a pretty important tool in your arsenal of using less. Variables, as stated before, are simply an @ sign, the name of the variable, colon, and then some value. Now this name has to start with a letter. Case sensitivity does matter, and you can use hyphens and underscores and numbers as part of that, but they can't begin the variable name. Variables, unlike the way you think about them in traditional programming, are constants. So redefining a color using another value doesn't actually do anything. The my color will continue to represent the FFEEDD color. No matter how much you try to assign it, it's not going to be reassigned. That's why there isn't an equals in less. It's simply an assignment and a single-use assignment. So the kind of things that can be stored in variables are colors, as we've seen, different kinds of units. Anything that can be considered a unit in CSS can be stored in a variable. You can have arbitrary strings. Notice they don't need to have quotations, just like in CSS, you don't need to surround them with quotations. And you can have complex types, in this case, something like the entire contents of a border. Operations are another feature of less. You can use operations to do calculated values to any name value pair inside of less. For example, setting the font size by taking the unit of 4 pixels and adding 4 will result in an 8 pixel value. 20 pixels times 0.8 is going to give you 16, or even dividing colors or doing operations on color values, it's going to treat those as numbers as well. Parentheses will allow you to control the order of operations like you would expect from a typical programming language. Now this is setting them directly inside of name value pairs. You could also do this with variables. You could say variable name plus 4 or variable name slash divided by 4. There are also a number of different kinds of functions that are supported in less, and some of the more useful ones are the color functions. So here you can use a lighten or darken function to take some value, in this case @color, and increase it by 10, lighten it by 10%, darken it by 10%, change the saturation levels, fade in, fade out, or just fade a color, which is going to change the transparency, or spin it across a color wheel. In this case, it's going to take a color and move it 10% across a color wheel, or mix two colors together in this case. Some more functions that are important here are getting the hue value from a color, getting saturation value from a color, getting the lightness value from a color, as well as the alpha channel values. You can generate a color based on the hue, saturation, light formula, as well as do typical math functions like round, ceiling, floor, and percentages as well. Let's mix these together and see them work in an actual example. So let's use variables and operations and functions to do some interesting work here. I'm going to start here at the top and create a new variable, and I'm going to call it base size. I'm going to say that the base size of our fonts are going to be 14 pixels in size. I'm going to copy this and just use it for our font size of our HTML so that all the text in our design is going to be 14 pixels in size. I don't want to have a bunch of these sizes be fixed, so I'm going to make them relative to the base size by using calculations. So here I'll just say that H3s are always going to be base size plus 2 pixels plus 4 pixels, and then finally plus 10 pixels. So we're going to specify the different levels of these based on formulas. We're going to take some base size that we defined and then allow it to resize itself based on that size going bigger. Now, we don't have to use simple addition. We could do something more complex if we want, but in this case, this should be good enough. So we refresh our page here, and it's giving us the same look, and that's because we were using the same values. But the benefit here is if we go ahead and change the value here, not only is it going to change our font size in our HTML, but it's going to upgrade all of the H1, 2, and 3 values to be larger as well. So you can see it made us bigger here, here, and here, all at the same time that we changed this value. And this is one of the big powers that you'll get from using less, is to be more adaptable. Again, fewer magic numbers, more computational changes to the design. So now let's go ahead and use some color functions so we can see how those work. We have this main color we're using for the back of the body, which we described as green a moment ago. And we're also using it here for our main color, but we don't want the color of our text to be exactly the same as the background. We'd like it to be a little darker, so we are just going to use the function called darken to make it just a little darker. Let's say 10% darker. If we go ahead and make this change and save it and look at it in our browser again, we'll see that our CSS has disappeared. And this is a clue to you that the CSS processing has failed and the browser couldn't make sense of what was delivered. Let's go over and look at our less file, navigating directly to it, and we can see here it's going to show us an error. When it shows an error, this is all that's produced by the less processor, and this will give us some clues to what's happening. We can see here it says expected a color in function darken, but found the value of green. Now green sounds like a color, but in fact for less, all colors need to be a numeric value. So it needs to be either a pound value or an HSL value for it to know how to do this function change. So let's open up our colors file. Instead of green, let's use the pound value for green, which is main color that. And let's refresh again. We see we're getting CSS again, so we can assume then that it didn't run into that error. Let's kind of prove it by looking down to our file, and we can see that our body is now green. Now, even though we're using that as the pound value, the less engine is going to attempt to make the simplest version of the color when it replaces it here. It's going to take that 008000 of the pound value that we put in there and replace it as green here because that's the simpler version. But if we come down here to our color, we'll see that the color has been lightened by 10% to be this new pound value. If we look at our page and refresh it again, we get this nice green in the background, but the color here of our text is just a bit darker. It is green. It might be hard to see in the video, but it's a much darker green, more of a forest green. We've darkened it by 10%. Let's head back to the slides. Next, we want to talk about mixins. This is lessons support for repeatable sections of CSS code. They look and feel like functions in that they can take input parameters and then can take one or more name value pairs into the CSS and inject them into different rules. And they can also accept, like I said, parameters, but as well as defaults and even overloads, much like functions can. Let's take a look at one. Mixins start with a name that starts with a period and then has an optional parameter that includes information you're going to use in the mixin. For instance, here is a fairly common mix-in to do rounded corners across different browsers. Border radius for HTML5 compliant browsers, and then the WebKit and Moz specific versions for Firefox and WebKit based browsers specifically. In this way, we can have a reusable element that says, let's round the corners of this object using an input, and then wherever we want this to be in a rule, we can simply say dot name of the mixin and then the size. This is going to, in the compiled CSS, take these 3 lines of name value pairs and inject them into the form rule. Mixins can have default values as well. In this case, we're specifying the size like we did before, but we're saying if it's not supplied, use 5 as the default. The inside of the mixin looks exactly the same, except in our use, we don't need to include the parentheses or the value. This will default to 5 automatically. In addition, we can use overloads, and this is much like overloads or default values in C# or VB, in that you can have the same mixin with a different set of parameters. And in this case, because we're using 2 parameters, it's going to find and use the mixin that matches that parameter set. Less also supports the notion of guards, and this is where you can have different mixins that are supported based on the actual values that are sent in. So in this case, this is saying, this is a mixin called color, and use this mixin when the color has an alpha channel of greater or equal than 50%. Otherwise, we can have another that says, use this one when the alpha channel is less than 50%. So in this case, a color being passed in will become black when it's more than 50% opaque, and if it's less than 50% opaque, it is just setting the color as transparent. And in this case, the main color that we're passing in happens to have an alpha channel of 100%, and so we're getting that color black inserted in here. You can also use type guards, and instead of it just being value-based, it can actually be type-based. In this example, we're saying use this with mixin when the size being passed in is a number, or if the size being passed in here, make it a percentage instead. And in this example, since the width is passing in 50%, it's going to use the second overload because the guard here is saying use this mixin when it is a percentage that's being passed in versus a straight off number. Let's see how that works. So here we are back in Visual Studio, and I want to go ahead and create a mixin and show some of these techniques. First thing I want to do is create a new file over here in my CSS directory. And I want this new file to be a new less file. Now there isn't a item template for less files, so I'm just going to use a text file since that's really all that less files are, and I'm going to call it mixins.less just to make it clear that I want a separate file to contain our mixins. Have this blank file here, and over in our main less file, I want to go ahead and import it. This way we're going to bring the mixins into the scope of this less file so that as we use them, we can go ahead and have access to them, much like bringing in a include or using statement in VB or C#. The way I'm going to write one of these is just to start with a period in the name of a mixin. In this case, I'm going to call it rounded corners. And I'm just going to give it an empty set of parameters because in this case, I'm not going to use any parameters. And to fill in this rounded corners, I'm actually just going to refactor by going and finding some pieces of our original CSS file. In this case, I'm going to grab those 3 name attribute pairs that represent making the rounded corners for our container, and we'll see later that we have them in a couple of different places. So I'm just going to cut that out and move it into our mixin. By having no parameters here, it means that we're going to make all the rounded corners in this particular case just the 5 pixels. This is going to take whatever's in this rounded corners mixin and just pluck it in to the CSS where we use this mixin. And let me show you where that is. Here in our container, I can just call the rounded corners either with an empty set of parameters or just as the name here, and it'll go ahead and inject this here. Let's go ahead and save this for the moment, and let's run this. Well, see, we still have our rounded corners, but let's really prove this out by going to our CSS file. The less file that is generated, we can see here in the container, we have that injected rounded corners that we had in the mix-in. Now we're only using it in one place, so it doesn't make a lot of sense to change it. So let's look through our original CSS file and see if there's any other places using rounded corners. And there we are, we have it again. So now we can go ahead and say rounded corners, so that any place we're going to end up using these rounded corners, we're going to have all of the pieces that are about that change. And if later on we find that we no longer need the Mozilla and the WebKit specific versions, we could get rid of them. If we find out there's an IE9 or IE10 version to get us those rounded corners before the HTML5 compliancy comes in, we could add it here. Creates that one place that the change can happen and it'll propagate, less copy and pasting. But in reality, just having these fixed corner sizes might be useful, but I'd like it to be parameterized. I want different parts of the UI to be able to specify how big those corners are. So I'm going to add a parameter in here, and I'm going to call it size, and just replace that parameter wherever the 5px is. This, again, is starting to look more like a method or a function, so that if we come back to the less, we can decide in our container to have 5 pixels in size, and down here in our form, let's go ahead and make it 10 pixels in size, so it's a bit bigger. Now we can see the container has a smaller rounded and this has a larger rounded corner now, so we can really decide what the sizes are in different instances. Again, if we go back and look at our less compiled CSS from the less file, we can see in the container itself it's using the 5 pixels, but later on when we look at the contact form where we used it again, we can see we're getting the 10 pixels. We're maintaining that reusability but making it parameterized. The last thing I'll show you is that you can have default values here as well. So in this case, I'm going to say, unless specified, use 5 pixels. So you can have something like a default value here. And all this is doing is adding a colon and then the default value so that you only have to use the override where needed. So if we come back to our less, we can very easily, in our container, say, let's use the default size here. And then our contact form will go ahead and use the new size, and we'll actually get the difference between them. And we can see that this is defaulted back to the 5, and then down in our form, we're using the 10 because we use the replacement value. Make sense? If we come back a little further down, we can see we have a brand new usage here. I want to typically replace all usages of something we can use as a mix-in with a mix-in. But in this case, I'm going to make it barely rounded at 2 pixels. Go back to our generated form, and now we can see that the 2 pixel size of our border radius is being shown. And we can now see the different change in our actual design. Great, let's head back to the slides.